originally from the East Coast, and when it's mornings like this and this time of year, I'm always so happy to break out the warm clothes. Good morning. Good morning.
You are free to use it if you.
Thank you. I'm probably going to be out here.
That's what I
But
thought.
it's fine. It's good to know. I'm glad to know that
I
people
will
do
push
respect
it.
the vertically challenged
This
among
is
us.
correct. I will. I'll push it in.
That's all right.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Forum. I'm your host, Stacy Clayman, and today it is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Yael Ridberg. But before I introduce her, let us pray. O God, the strength of all who put their trust in you, mercifully accept our prayers, and because in our weakness we can do nothing good without you, give us the help of your grace, that in keeping your commandments we may please you both in will and deed, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. This morning, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Yael Ridberg. She has been the rabbi of Congregation Dor Hadash since 2010. A 1997 graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Ridberg served for 2 years as the first Marshall T. Meyer Rabbinic Fellow at Congregation B'nai Yeshurun in New York. From 1998 to 2010, Rabbi Ridberg served for 12 years as a rabbi at West End Synagogue in New York City, 3 years as the associate rabbi before becoming the sole rabbi of that congregation. An active lay leader in Jewish communal life, Rabbi Ridberg currently serves as the president of the San Diego Rabbinic Association and is a board member of the Lawrence Family Jewish JCC. A past president of the Board of Trustees at the San Diego Jewish Academy, Rabbi Ridberg has served on the Board of Jewish Family Services of San Diego and is also a past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. Rabbi Ridberg is a passionate teacher and advocate of Jewish engagement and social justice. She is a sought-after teacher and lecturer for many Jewish organizations, including Jewish Federation of San Diego, the Melton Program, Coastal Roots Farm, JFC, and the LFJCC lecture series. Her writing has appeared in Times of Israel, Huffington Post, and Kveler, and Rabbi Ridberg is an author and commentator for the Guide to Jewish Reconstructionist Practice series published by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and is a chapter author for the 2007 URJ publication Life, Faith, and Cancer. A transplanted New Yorker, she lives in La Jolla with her husband and children. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Ridberg.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to learn and to teach. I think probably the most popular, observed, celebrated holiday in the entire Jewish calendar. And that is, of course, the holiday of Passover, which comes just in about a month and change. And I was asked to comment a little bit about, in particular, the Seder plate, the ritual meal, some of the customs that we do. And, oh, good morning. Thank you for having me here. And I'm going to do that, but I need to warn you, because this is the most celebrated, the most honored, the most, like, the biggest holiday in the Jewish calendar, like, to ask a rabbi to talk about Passover in 60 minutes, it is an exercise, it is a spiritual practice to do that. So I am really a fan of text study. So rather than lecture at you, I want to study with you, because in order to really understand how we got to this particular ritual, we have to go pretty far back, as I'm sure many of you can imagine and know. Okay, so I have some, I didn't get a good collator going, so it's 2 pages. I have about 20 of them, so if we have more than 20, you will get to do what we do in a Jewish study center, and you'll be able to do what's called chavruta, which is like studying with a friend, partner, and you'll share, because I think we can share. Okay. So I'm pretty sure I don't have to tell this crowd about, like, when Passover was first celebrated, do I? Do I need to remind you when Passover was first celebrated? Or at least what is understood to have been a Passover meal, right? At least in my understanding, right, the Last Supper was just that, the Passover Seder. Or at least the Passover meal, because we don't know exactly, at least in our tradition, what was done at that meal, because it's not part of our tradition, that meal as a celebratory event. However, we go back to the story, the foundational story of the Jewish people, which is, of course, the Exodus from Egypt. And somehow, the Exodus from Egypt, throughout rabbinic, or throughout the Jewish history, came to represent an opportunity not only to tell this foundational story, but to do so in ways that everyone, most importantly children, will understand why we do what we do, and what is the value of the storytelling that we share every year. So I'm going to begin with this rabbinic text. So when I talk about the rabbinic period, I'm talking about the period from about really the 1st to the 3rd century of the Common Era. And when I talk about the Common Era, you often call that AD, right? But we Jews don't mark time according to the death of Jesus. We mark time in terms of the era, so before the Common Era and after the Common Era. We still are in the Common Era. So the rabbinic period is the period of time following the destruction of the Second Temple. The destruction of the Second Temple, of course, was done by the Romans. And as a result of the destruction of the Second Temple and the loss of the sacred center of the Jewish people, rabbis, teachers, right, went out, and the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile, went out to reimagine, literally, how to be Jews. because they were no longer biblical Jews. There was no temple. They couldn't exercise their sacrificial rites. They couldn't live by what they understood to be the biblical way of worship. So they had to come up with and evolve, right, a new way of doing Jewish. And so the rabbis did just that. They took the biblical text and they said, okay, how does this relate to us today? And so religious evolution within Jewish history begins. The most simple way to describe it to you, and then we'll get to the text, is that so the tradition for Jews around eating, right, keeping kosher, is delineated in the Bible around animals. What is prohibited and what is permitted. And those categories are very clear. Yes to animals that chew their cud and have split hooves. No to basically everything else. Okay? But when the rabbis came into being, and they started to look at this system, they said, well, hold on, we're not agricultural, we're not shepherds anymore, and we don't really own any livestock. So what could this mean? Oh, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, which is the one line in the whole Torah that says anything about cooking in this regard. They said, oh, it must mean don't mix meat and milk together. Okay, well, that could be a really good system. But then they said, no, 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 wait a minute. Now it actually means also that if you eat meat, you have to wait 6 hours before you eat dairy again. And then they said, wait, 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 no, that's not enough. We need to have 2 sets of dishes, and they can't be porous. They have to be not able to transfer the food source. And I know, now what it means is we might want to have 2 dishwashers in our kitchen. And in the most extreme, it might mean we have 2 kitchens. That's not my house. But you see that all it takes for the rabbis is to take one line of biblical text and evolve and understand how to take that one line and make it into a system. So that's the rabbinic period standing on one foot. So now let's look together at sort of how Passover becomes a ritualized practice. So we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the law book from the basically same period, 3rd century of the Common Era. And what you see in this first text, let me explain. The bolded text is what actually appears in the Mishnah. The not bolded text is the sort of the filling in between the lines so that it makes sense when we read it in English. Okay. I will start to read, but then I want to invite you guys to read too. So Rabban Gamliel, one of the ancient sages, would say, anyone who did not say these 3 matters on Passover has not fulfilled the obligation, meaning to celebrate Passover. Passover is, of course, one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Passover, the Festival of Weeks, and then the Festival of Booths. These are the 3 pilgrimage festivals in the Torah, in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, where the ancient Israelites would make their way to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices. They were called the pilgrimage festivals because everybody went from around the country. So we have an obligation, right? Anyone who does not talk about these 3 things on Passover hasn't fulfilled the obligation. And what are these 3 things? The Paschal lamb, matzah, the unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. So, is any of this sort of like remotely, generically familiar to you as human beings in the world? Like, these things are not totally foreign, also because you've probably read this from the book of Deuteronomy or the book of Exodus that tells these stories. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, when one mentions these matters, one must elaborate and explain them. And in that verse, in that notion right there, you get the derivation of the Seder. Because at the Seder, we sit down and talk about each one of these things. We tell the story of the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, and we understand the spiritual journey that we've been on as a people. So the Paschal lamb is brought because the omnipresent God passed over, Pasach in Hebrew. Pasach, that's the word for Pesach in Hebrew, which is Passover, literally passed over. right? The angel passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt, as it is stated, that you shall say, it is the sacrifice of God's paschal offering, for God passed over the houses of the children of Israel when God smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. So we're going to talk about, in the Seder, we talk about the sacrifice. Okay, number 2. Yeah, I can't really read without these, sorry. The reason for matzah, right, the unleavened bread, is because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt, as it is stated, and they baked the dough that took them out of Egypt as cakes of matzah. For it was not leavened, as they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared themselves any victual. So the story, of course, is that they were told, you know, get ready to leave. And they baked with flour and water, what they thought was going to be some bread. But in their haste and in their need to leave right away, there was no time to rise these cakes of bread, and they turned into matzah. Now, I know that matzah can be found in Ralph's almost all year round, no matter what the Jewish holiday. God bless Ralph's. I don't know very many Jews that like to eat matzah any other time of year because it's not exactly, right, the most flavorful, delicious, fluffy thing ever. If you like matzah, you can have it all year round. I'm only going to eat it at Passover. Okay. And then finally, the reason for the bitter herbs is because the Egyptians embittered our ancestors. As it is stated, and they embittered their lives with hard service, mortar and brick, and all manner of service in the field, all the service that made them serve with rigor. So again, we have a sacrifice, we have the unleavened bread, and then we have this centerpiece, maror in Hebrew, bitter herb. So a little something about Jews. It's never just happy all the time. Not only because to be a human being in the world is not always happy, but because for Jews, most of our history has been happy and sad, joyous and difficult. And we go back and forth throughout our history. And so at every moment, we hold those two realities in our storyline. Even at a wedding, the last thing that happens at a Jewish wedding is that the rabbi places a glass on the ground and asks the groom to step on it. And he breaks that glass as a way to remind ourselves that in this moment of unity, two people falling in love, coming together, the world is still a broken place. And it harkens back to the destruction of the Second Temple and pretty much every bad thing that ever happened to the Jewish people. And so here we are at this joyous meal that celebrates our Passover, our exodus from Egypt, and we're eating bitter herbs. And in a minute, we'll talk about the other things that we eat that symbolize that hardship, because we should not forget, that's in our DNA, that these two things coexist. There's a very ancient and well-worn Jewish joke that if you want to understand Jewish holidays, you say, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And our sad fast days, they tried to kill us, we lost. You can laugh at that too, it's okay. Okay. All right, so finally, the Tana, which is the teacher, the Tana of the Mishnah further states, in each and every generation, a person must view him or herself as though they personally left Egypt. As it is stated, and you shall tell your child on that day, saying, it's because of this which God did for me when I came forth from Egypt. In every generation, each person must say, this which God did for me, and not this which God did for someone else, or my ancestors. The Mishnah continues with the text of the Haggadah. The Haggadah is the book that we read from at the Seder, at the Passover meal, that tells the story, that includes these rituals, and explains it all. Therefore, we are obligated to thank and praise and glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, and laud The one who performed for our forefathers and for us all these miracles. God took us from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, and from enslavement to redemption. And we will say before God, hallelujah. Okay. So far, so good? This is the ritual meal. We sit down, we tell this story, we have some sort of symbols already emerging in the Mishnah of what we're supposed to look at. So we already have three things. What are they? Some sort of bone, right? Some sort of roasted bone symbolizing the sacrifice. We have matzah, unleavened bread. And we have maror, bitter herbs. Now, maybe we could say, that's enough. Doesn't that tell the whole story? Right? No. Okay. Would someone please read the next passage that says, it's from the Mishnah Torah, which is a slightly later text. It's a medieval text. Somebody can read that on the first night of Passover. Anybody want to read? Yes, please, Stacy.
On the first night of Passover, one should introduce some change at the table, so that the children who will notice it may ask, saying, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" And one in turn will reply, "This is what happened." In what manner, for example, should a change be introduced? One may distribute parched grain or nuts to the children, remove the table from its usual place, snatch the unleavened bread from hand to hand, and so on. If a man has no son, his wife should ask the questions. If he has no wife, they should ask one another, "Why is this night different?" Even if they are all scholars. If one is alone, one should ask, "Why is this night different?"
Okay. This is the core reason why we even evaluate, or why we even create a Passover Seder. Because, as we'll look in a little bit, the Bible has many moments where the redactor, the narrator, the writer, right, says, you know, in the future, someone's going to ask, why do you do this? What is the point of all of this? And you need to have an answer, and it can't just be because I said so. Although that's kind of embedded, right, in the answers that we give. So all the way back to the Middle Ages, there's this notion that Passover represents something really unique. And that story, that foundational story, needs to be taught to the next generation. They need to see themselves, right? We read in the Talmud, they need to see themselves. Every person, bechol dor vador, it is in Hebrew, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, that every person must see themselves as if they personally came forth from Egypt, thereby making the story as contemporary as possible. And they said that way back then. They had no idea how the Passover Seder would evolve in a modern context. But so they figure, well, it's dinner, your children are at the table. How do you make the table, how do you make the experience different from every other dinner? Okay, you answer. You want to make a special meal at your house, and there are children coming to that meal. How do they know it's not just a regular Tuesday? What are the things that you do to make the table different? What do you do? Like, I'm talking, do you have a special tablecloth? Yeah, I'm really talking, as we say, tachlis, really practically here. What do you do to make a table special when you have a special occasion? Might have the special dishes, right? There might be a tablecloth, right? Candles. What, sorry? Flowers on the table, right? And when everybody sits down, right, and maybe you have a couple of generations at the table, someone is at the head of the table, right? And someone, if not at the head, somewhere, you know, convenes the gathering and says something about the why of being there. And maybe they even like shed a tear or two to reflect on, oh, how amazing it is that all these generations are here, right? And there's a story being told in that moment to be remembered by the smallest among you. Oh yeah, that's when we went to that house and we had, oh, there were those special flowers or the table, right? So we know that children automatically notice when something is different. They just do. And they say, well, wait, what? You know, like my kids used to say, why are we eating in the dining room? And I was like, well, because we are a family of 6 and we only have 4 chairs in the kitchen. No, I mean, that's true. But why do we hold out for things so that ritually they are meaningful? And we do that, right, because kids are going to ask us why. And so all the way back, the kids are going to ask, why is this night different? Like, what gives? And it's not just to say, oh, it's a special occasion. It's an opportunity to tell the story. So what do you have to do? It says, oh, well, you should change something. Maybe you give them some nuts to start. Maybe you never have nuts as an appetizer. Maybe you move the table from its usual place. And maybe you do other things that are different. But the point is to ask, why is this night different? And so begins the participation part of the Seder. Because right at the beginning, we are given an order to go through, and the very first thing, or one of the very first things that happens is we have not 1, but 4 questions that are posed by the youngest child at the Seder. That's the tradition, right? That the youngest child should ask the questions, assuming they can read them or sing them. And they are actually recited not in English and not in Hebrew, but they are recited, sung in Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud, the ancient rabbinic language that is not spoken anymore, but it is used in the text. But let's read what the questions are, and then I'll sing you a little. Okay, someone wants to ask the first question. And it also gives an answer. So look at the bottom where it says, Pesach Haggadah Magid, which is the storytelling part of the Seder. 4 questions. What's the first question? So.
Children ask you, what do you mean by this?
Oh, no, sorry, at the bottom of the first page.
Oh, sorry.
What differentiates?
This night from all other nights.
And give us the answer.
On all other nights we eat hummus, leavened bread, and matzah. This night only matzah.
So in Aramaic, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot. What differentiates? What makes this night different from all other nights? Bechol halaylot anu ochlin chametz umatzah. On all other nights we eat, well, your choice, unleavened bread or leavened bread. You get to choose. On this night, only matzah. So we get a question and an answer at the same time, which is exactly really what kids want, right? They want instant gratification. Okay, second question. Someone else asked that. On all other nights, someone, same place.
On all other nights, we eat other vegetables. Tonight, only maror.
Yep, bitter herbs. Bechol halaylot anu ochlin she'ar yirakot balayla hazeh maror. On all other nights, we eat any vegetable we want. But on this night, we focus on the bitter herb. Okay, question number 3. Go ahead.
On all other nights, we don't dip our food even one time. Tonight, we dip it twice.
Bechol halelot. How does it go? Bechol halelot anu matbilin afilu pa'am echat. We don't dip anything. Afilu pa'am echat. No. Halayla hazeh shetei fe'amim. On this night, we dip twice. We're going to talk about what's all that dipping going on. And then the 4th question.
On all other nights, we eat either sitting or reclining. Tonight, we all
Bechol halelot. Bechol halelot. Anu. God, I can't remember it. Hold on. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. But on all other nights, we don't lie down. We sit up at the table. Right? Now we're reclining. Okay. The last one wasn't even a question. It was just a statement. But they're all answers to the question, how is this night different from all other nights? And why would we recline, do you think, at this particular meal? What is this? If you have like a super comfy chair or lounge, you know, like at your table, what does it say about you?
You're free.
You're free. you are able to enjoy the meal, right? If you are an enslaved person, you're probably shackled, you're probably sitting at a table on a hard chair. So the last question is to signify that we get to do something because we're liberated, because we're a people of leisure. Hardly, but you get the point. So these questions are asked, and the Seder then, the Seder meal, is really an opportunity to fully answer those questions, to tell the story of the Passover, of the Exodus from Egypt, to remember the degradation and the bitterness of slavery, to dip a vegetable, again, as a kind of a sense of like, both because it'll be in salt water, which we'll talk about, a remembrance of the tears and the degradation of Egypt, but it also harkens back to, if you remember from the Exodus story, right before the last plague, the death of the firstborn of Egypt, the commandment goes to the Israelites that they should dip like a bunch of hyssop into the blood from the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb, and to paint the doorposts of their home, so that the angel of death, when it passes over Egypt, it knows the Israelite homes. And that's a protection from that death. And just as a side note, if you've ever visited a Jewish home, and this Jewish home happens to do this, although most Jewish homes do have, you might be standing at the doorway to the house, and if you just look on the right side of the doorpost, you might see a sort of a box. It looks like a box on the side of the doorposts, and there might be a letter shin that looks like a, you know, when you hold up 3. That's called a mezuzah. That is a box that holds sacred parchment of the watchword of the Jewish faith, the Shema, the pronouncement of the oneness of God, and subsequent texts, and they're put in the mezuzah, and the mezuzah is affixed on the doorpost of the house for the same reason as a sign of protection. It's an amulet. And it's such a practice that, especially in New York City, if you like go find a new apartment, you like want to look for an apartment, usually the mezuzah is left there. If a Jewish family has lived there and they've left, they leave the mezuzah. It is a way to signify who we are. It's also, of course, a way historically where Jews have removed their mezuzot so as not to be seen, as to hide. But it's all about the protection, right? So the dipping of the vegetables in the salt water that we're going to get to is also connected to the dipping of the, the paint hyssop bunch that then went around the doorposts. Okay, any question about the questions, or so far about anything I've said? Okay, let's keep going. So we don't have to read each of these texts, but I wanted you to see the places in the Bible where the notion of asking questions comes and then is formulated into the Haggadah, right? And they're all repetition. They're repeated, right? When your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You're going to say, it's the Passover sacrifice to God who passed over the houses of the Israelites, right? And you shall explain to your child, it's because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. And when in a time to come, a child of yours asks, so what does this mean? You're going to reply, it's with a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt and the house of bondage. And then finally in Deuteronomy, which, you know, Deuteronomy is like a complete recapitulation of Exodus and Numbers. It's like Moses is telling the people who didn't experience the slavery and the redemption, because of course that generation had to be wiped out in the wilderness once they didn't believe the story of the spies in the book of Numbers as to the nature of the land. Because they didn't believe, the punishment was the entire generation that was born, or rather that was in Egypt and then received the law at Sinai, had to die out. So when in Deuteronomy these verses are being said by Moses, he's telling a generation that didn't know it themselves. He's telling them that when in time to come your children ask, what mean the decrees and laws and rules that God has enjoined upon you, you're going to say to your children, we were slaves, avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. God wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household, and us God freed from there in order to take us and give us the land as promised. So we have embedded in Jewish tradition this notion that we pass along the stories of our history and our past and our ancestry because we need people, the next generation, to know it, even if they didn't experience it themselves. That's not unique, of course, to the Jewish story, but it is foundational to how we think about where we come from. I would say most American Jews today can trace back knowingly, even without having known probably at least 4 generations. So 3 of my grandparents, so I'm 54, 3 of my grandparents were born in America, which is pretty amazing for my generation. I have 1 grandparent that was born in Romania, but I know the names of my great and great grandparents, and I know where they came from, but I don't know too far back. It's hard to know, right? But when you know the ancestry, you tell the story, and that's, of course, not unique to us. Okay, so that's the biblical grounding for why biblical analytical rabbinic grounding for why we do what we do. But you see, we all need props. I don't mean like props, like I'm so great. I mean props, right? So if you turn to the next page, I'm sorry for the quality of the copy, but I have a color copy here. This is the Seder plate. So, like we talked about, we need distraction at the Seder. We need to know, and we need to be able to point to things that help us understand why we do what we do. So, if you're looking at your Seder plate, start at 12 o'clock, okay? At 12 o'clock, approximately, or it's really 1, it should look like lettuce. Then just below that, at 2 o'clock, there are bones, like the roasted lamb bone. Below that, we're going to talk about what it is. It looks like a mash. It's called charoset, which is made from a variety of things, fruit and nuts, that when looking at it, it looks like the mortar, apparently, that the Israelites were forced to put between the bricks in building all of Egypt. Then when you get to the sort of 6 o'clock, you can't tell at all, but this is red horseradish, i.e. maror, the bitter herb. And then up above at 9, you've got another spring vegetable for dipping into the salt water, and then you have the roasted egg. So the list below are the things that go on the Seder plate. Carp, and I've given you the Aramaic or the Hebrew words as well. So we have karpas, the vegetable, often parsley. Some people use like the celery, you see the celery there, so that the vegetable isn't bitter, but the dipping in the salt water that comes at a particular time in the Seder is bitter. Some people use the romaine as that vegetable. I use parsley. They've got the beitzah, roasted egg. The egg also represents spring and the birth of the Jewish people after they fled slavery. The roasting recalls the Passover sacrifice brought into the temple in Jerusalem in ancient times. Charoset, that's that deliciousness that you can't really see from the black and white photo. Typically a mixture of fruits and nuts. So if you are of the Ashkenazi tradition, which is the Eastern European Jewish tradition, you generally cut up apples, very small, and walnuts, and you pour some manischewitz in there, maybe with some grape juice, and you like put it all together. And it's delectable in a particular way. But if you're of the Sephardic tradition, which is the Jews from like North Africa, Spain, you might use like apricots and dates and almonds, even ginger in the Syrian way, and it becomes very pasty. That, to me, that's much more of like literally paste. Like you could put it between two pieces of matzah and nothing moves. Okay. The zeroah, that's the Hebrew word for the roasted bone, also representative of the Passover sacrifice. And if you're vegetarian, you can roast a beet. Yes, we want to be all-inclusive. Maror, bitter herbs, often horseradish. My grandfather, may his memory be for a blessing, he would call it chrein, that's in Yiddish, and his job was to sit at the table before the Seder and grate the horseradish, and he would just weep because, you know, it's like an onion, but worse. But chrein, there's nothing like eating fresh horseradish. Chazeret, most Seder plates have an additional place for another bitter herb. That's what I was talking about, the romaine. And then we have this cup of salt water that lives on the table. It's not really on the Seder plate, but it's on the table. And the salt water is because in the moment of eating the karpas, in the moment of eating the spring vegetable, we dip it into the salt water to once again remind ourselves of the bitterness of Egypt. It's a celebratory meal, of course. But again, by retelling the story, in order for us to know and feel, like the text says, that each of us came forth from Egypt, the ritual meal has to offer that experience to us. In the Sephardic community, most notably in the Syrian Jewish community, at the moment where we sing this song of "We were slaves in Egypt," there's a plate of scallions on the table, and everyone takes a full scallion and beats their neighbor with it. Like the whipping of the slaves, but with the scallion. So many symbols, so many ritual foods. We're not supposed to eat any leavened products throughout the week of Passover. So it's not just matzah, although now it's like a whole industry, and I can't really say that I'm that big a fan of like kosher for Passover cereal or kosher for Passover pasta. I'd rather just not eat that stuff. But growing up, you know, that's what we did. We cleared the house of all of our chametz, all of the leavened products. My mother would put them in bags, put them in the basement, tuck them away. Because we're not supposed to own them. So we would tuck them away. There are other rituals around that. What we do, and we ask our non-Jewish neighbors to, quote, buy our chametz from us, like for $1, just so that it transfers ownership. And then you give us back the $1 at the end of the week, and we give you, or whatever, you keep the $1. I can't remember. I never did that because it felt weird to me that I should sell my chametz to non-Jews. But we just put ours in the basement. So this is the Seder plate. Now, we don't really eat what's on the Seder plate. It mostly is for show, because if the charoset that's on the Seder plate, you also have like dishes around the table so that by the time we get to the ritual meal, and we're like starving, it seems, there's what to eat. And we put the charoset on the matzah as we recall the sweetness of the freedom with the matzah, but we also make what's called a Hillel sandwich. And the Hillel sandwich, which comes from the sage Hillel, that to put the matzah with the maror and the charoset together, the bitter and the sweet, to be that emblematic experience again of why this holiday is celebratory for our freedom, but it is meant to remind us of from where we came. Any questions so far on that? I know oh, perfect. Or any comments in general? Has anybody ever been to a Seder? Have you had a Jewish relative or family member or neighbor like invite you to the Seder? Anybody? Yes. What do you remember from that?
We went through the whole ritual.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting to think about. I was just thinking as you spoke of the bitter and the sweet. It's life. It's symbolism. There's so much of it.
Yeah, the life, the notion of the bitter and the sweet is really life, and that perhaps is the essential notion of Passover for us. That like we don't get a perfect life, right? Perfection doesn't exist, although we Jewish mothers, we like to think that it does in our children, but No one's ever really managed to make that work. But there's no perfection. There's just life, and it's messy, and it's bitter, and we suffer, but we also are grateful for the gift that it is. Yes, absolutely. Anybody else been to a Seder that you remember something special? Yeah.
I'd like to chair, and we left the door open in case somebody came.
Okay, so Elijah, the prophet, is part of the Seder. There is a moment in the Seder where, like all good ritual, it really is magical thinking, right? In the best possible way. That's not being irreverent, that's just, truth. So we open the door to Elijah. Elijah the prophet is meant to be the one who heralds the world to come for Jews, right? Heralding the Messianic era. Because we don't believe in a personal Messiah, Elijah is the one to herald the time of the Messiah. And so we have a cup on the table that we fill with grape juice or wine, which is Elijah's cup, thinking that he would participate in this moment of redemption. And then we open the door and we imagine that he enters to help us bring about redemption. Because as modern Jews, we can have whatever theology we want. We can still believe in a supernatural God. But at the end of the day, God has got to function through us. And we're the ones that have to bring about redemption. That's our job. That's our partnership with God. That's what we do. So we welcome in Elijah. A modern twist, if you will, on extra cups at the table is that there's also now a cup of Miriam. Miriam the prophet, right? Miriam the sister of Moses. Miriam who saved him, right, from the Nile, gave him to Batya, right, the daughter of Pharaoh. So there's a cup of water to symbolize the healing waters of Miriam, and many communities use both of those things. And there's music, there's an opportunity to remember her as we celebrate our women prophets and that part of the story, which it's there, but it's not in the traditional Haggadah. Any other things about a Seder? Yes, Stacy.
Okay, so of course we know I have been to a Seder. I was the youngest. I didn't see the four questions in Hebrew. We did have, I have my mother's Passover plate. We did have the cup of Elijah at the center of the table. And if you could just imagine, my sister was 4 and I was 7. We were sent to the front door to open it for Elijah to come in. And we got back to the table, and the cup of wine was empty. So, drank the entire cup of wine one year, and my sister and I were just amazed.
Man ishtana halayla hazeh, right? Somebody drinks the water or the wine. I mean, like, you have to entertain your children, right? You have to keep them guessing, right? You had your hand up also. Did you want to say something before?
I have been fascinated and wonder about that Jewish concept of tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam, the repairing of the world, yes.
This Seder event seems to feed into that.
Well, so very interesting connection. Thank you for that. So the traditional Seder looks like the traditional Seder. Like there's an order, you do it exactly as prescribed. My grandmother's family, my grandmother was an orphan, but her cousin, when we used to go to his Seder, he would say every single word of the Seder, which is not exactly enticing for small children. However, I do remember, that's his melody that I sang at the beginning. But the story lends itself to such a modern understanding of the search for redemption and the quest for justice. And so this idea of tikkun olam, this idea of repairing the world, which is a sort of a global Jewish concept, comes into the Seder when, in any given year, there might be additional items that Jews place on their Seder plate or on their Seder table to bring to mind some issue or some current struggle in the world that helps us make the notion of redemption as an ongoing thing. So many, many years ago, Susanna Heschel, who is the daughter of the late theologian, one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel, was told that women and LGBTQ people are appropriate as rabbis, quote unquote, he said, as if an orange were appropriate for a Seder plate. It was a demeaning comment, right? To say, no, there's no role for LGBTQ people, there's no role for women, and it's about as useful, a woman rabbi or a gay rabbi is about as useful as an orange on a Seder plate. So guess what's on every Seder plate of a liberal family almost throughout the country, if not the world, is an orange sits on the Seder plate. Throughout the years, there have been other things. There's the plight of the Immokalee Mexican workers that pick tomatoes, and so sometimes people put a tomato on their Seder plate. Sometimes to symbolize the ongoing struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, there's an olive branch or a cup of olives on the Seder plate or on the table. The idea is to modernize, contemporize this story because there's slavery all over the world. The plight of people is still in question. And so we use this Seder as a way not only to connect to our past, but to remind us for what we are doing in the world, our job, right? To bring redemption and to repair the world as best we can. Any other comments on this before we get to the sort of the ending here? Okay. So when you turn to the back page, you get a little more of the description of Karpas in particular. Since I know that was a little bit of the origin of how I came to be with you this morning, I wanted to include that. So from the Haggadah, it says that you take from the greens less than a size of an olive. It says kazayit. You're supposed to take a small amount and dip it, because you don't want to, it's not, okay. In general, everything you eat requires a blessing, traditionally, in Judaism. But it has to be the right amount of food to warrant the blessing. And so to make it so that you don't have to say the blessing here, you take a very small amount of greens, and you dip it into the salt water, and then you say the blessing over who creates the fruit of the earth, because that's what it comes from. You don't have to say that, and have in mind that this blessing will also be for the bitter herbs. So it's like, it's doing double duty. You don't have to say redundant blessings. And then in a later commentary from the late 1800s, we find this. By dipping the greens in salt water or vinegar, he still remembers the time when he was humbled while in Egypt, and that God took us out of subjugation so that we could reach this exalted level. This is a sort of a Hasidic or Kabbalistic understanding, the sort of the heightened awareness of where we are. The dipping of Karpas alludes to two opposing ideas, subjugation and freedom. First, it symbolizes subjugation when our lives were like the vinegar or the salt water, and in the end it symbolizes the merit of dipping the hyssop when we fulfilled the commandment of placing the blood on the doorposts of our homes so that Israel was saved from the death of the firstborn, and afterwards they went forth to freedom. So I think you can see, and I hope that this is clear, that, you know, we looked at a biblical text, we looked at a rabbinic text, then we're looking at a more modern day text. And in a minute, we're going to read a contemporary text. And they all carry through the same themes, the same ideas, because Judaism is an evolving religious civilization. We're not just a religion, and we're not just a culture, and we're not just, you know, people who are we're not just culinary, although there are many culinary Jews. We are the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people, and peoplehood is at our core. And so when we think and celebrate, we have to go back. We have to pull through all of the things we did and all of our past in order to ground ourselves in the present and really think about, well, what are they going to do in the future? What are my children going to do? What are they going to put on the Seder plate? How are they going to mark Passover? But certain things remain the same. In every generation, we are to see ourselves as if we came out of Egypt. We say, let all who are hungry come and eat. We invite guests to our Seder of all faiths, right? We open the doors to Elijah because we believe in heralding a world to come where there's no conflict or strife. So finally, This is from a modern Haggadah. Was published in, I want to say, either late 90s, early 2000s. Again, and this is a comment in the Haggadah. So remember I told you that there's like a traditional Haggadah. By the way, Maxwell House, right? Maxwell House, the coffee maker. Famous not just for making coffee. Famous because in the 1940s, I think, they printed a Haggadah. And it was forever called the Maxwell House Haggadah. And they would give it with purchases of the coffee to, you know, families who needed a Haggadah. And then they would drink their, you know, Maxwell House coffee, God help them, afterwards, or on Passover because it was kosher and whatever. But anyway, but it didn't have anything in the Haggadah except for the text of the Haggadah. So now Haggadot that are published all have like commentary around the edges and ways to understand this holiday and these rituals differently. So what does it say? Karpas represents spring and new growth, rebirth and the beginning of new life. We taste in this fresh vegetable all the potential in nature and in ourselves. Tonight we celebrate our growth, the flowering of our spirit and of our voices. We do not taste the vegetable alone. We dip it into salt water, recalling the tears our ancestors shed during their long years in slavery. We mix bitterness with sweetness, slavery with freedom, past with future. We live with the contrasts, as you said before, right? Because we know that no moment exists without a multitude of combinations, sorrow and joy, pain and comfort, despair and hope. Other questions or things I didn't answer, or, you know, in the 2 minutes left, approximately, like burning questions now that you have a rabbi in front of you. It doesn't have to be on Passover. I'm really good on the fly.
Is there a simplified version that somebody who didn't record the speech?
A simplified version of the Haggadah, or of... I'm asking, is that what you're asking? A simplified version of the celebration of Passover? So here's what I want to say. So that order that I saw, that the things that are on the Seder plate, there is an order to the Seder, and you can, you know, you could go Google what's the order of the Seder. You could join a Jewish family in the recitation of these rituals, and you could learn them. And I want to suggest that understanding the what comes from being aware of how Jews celebrate, right? And learning it, not because you're going to celebrate it necessarily or do it that way, but so that you can understand how we do that. And so you can read, and there's a simple, it's meant to be simple. The Passover Seder is meant to be, as I've said, so that everybody can understand, whether you're Jewish or not, whether you're a child or an adult. But this ritual for the Jewish communities all over the world is that moment where we really solidify our identity. It's like this is our story. It's a master story that other communities obviously look to understand the origins of all of humanity in some ways, and also how we understand what we're supposed to do from degradation to dignity, and how every people could follow that. If you want something like really tangible, like, Rabbi, stop talking, just tell me where to go to look. If you Google My Jewish Learning, Passover, you will get whatever you want. Free on the internet, because we live in the 21st century, and you can find whatever you want on the internet for free. Okay, other questions or comments? MyJewishLearning.com, yes?
I hear you saying that non-Jews could be invited to Seders, but how do you feel about non-Jews and Christians having their own Seder without?
Yeah, it's not really prescribed. In modern day language, it would be falling into the cultural appropriation category, right? Which is to say, Well, and I understand that there's an especially complicated or desirous ritual, right, for the Christian faith, because it does have that relationship to the notion, to the Last Supper, Jesus' crucifixion, and all of those things. But because that's how those things spin out in Christian tradition, to take the Jewish holiday or the ritual and sort of make it into a Christian one is not, it's not desired. Yeah.
Also, I mean, it is part of our tradition. We are
Yes.
Christians, so,
Yes, the story of the origin of Christianity comes from a Jewish guy, but even the idea of Judeo-Christian has its limitations because we are two different communities where we have evolved an understanding theologically and ritually that's different, right? So we who don't subscribe to the New Testament as a sacred text of tradition, but you who subscribe to the Old Testament as part of your sacred tradition, well, that doesn't make them equal, right? So it doesn't make it equal access for everybody to do those things, as attractive as it would be. Like, you know, thank you for the question, though. I appreciate that. Yes?
Well, I'm still thinking about how I could do this with what's available to us. And I have a backyard with marvelous variety of greens of various kinds that we use, that we live in.
Yeah.
And there are the bitter and the sweet and things like that. So would it be stupid for me just to try to imitate those?
I would never call it stupid. But what I would say is it's really a beautiful thing to honor another community's tradition by recognizing its meaning, but not recognizing it as meaningful to you if it's not your tradition. In other words, you can learn and you can educate yourself, and then if you're invited to a Seder, you can participate. But just because something is meaningful doesn't mean that we can have it, right? If it's not our tradition.
Well, or that I could produce some sort of little gimlet of stuff from the garden. That's what.
Listen, you want to create an homage to the notion of spring and liberation and those general concepts, and you want to, I don't know, create something that you're inspired by the story to do. I can't, inspiration is inspiration, but to actually recreate a Seder when it's not your tradition, that's a bridge too far. Yes?
What do you think of the Messianic Judaism movement that I think came into being in the 1960s?
Yeah.
I know a couple of people who embraced that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, it's a good question, what they are. It is a good question. I don't mean that pejoratively.
Can you repeat that for those watching at home?
Sure. The question is about what are Messianic Jews? And I said, I'm not exactly sure what they are, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that in the way that, just as I was saying, right, Judaism and Christianity are two faith traditions. And there are some pretty diverting elements that make that so. And so it's hard to imagine a Jewish person giving credence to the story of Jesus as the Son of God when Jews don't hold that story and don't see the historic figure of Jesus as any more than a historic figure that then a later generation of people, including Jews, obviously, because there were no other kinds of people then, right, saw his teachings as being emblematic of a different path to take. And so Messianic Jews, I think, technically believe that Jesus is their Messiah, but I would question the Jewish part of that identity.
The people I know who embrace the movement are Christians.
And that's really how Jews view Messianic Jews, as Christians. Yeah. One or two more questions, because I know the time is short, and I don't want to outstay my welcome. Yes.
Well, it's always a puzzle to me
Islam jumped on Jesus' boat, and they accept him as a prophet of the Jewish tradition. And there's a whole chapter about Mary in, they revere Mary. It's not mentioned in the Jewish
Right. So,
whatsoever.
right.
And I just wondered how did the Jewish tradition just skip over that?
Okay, so really quick, standing on one foot, without judgment. Judaism comes first, right? A Jew by the name of Jesus of Nazareth thinks that something different should happen and preaches a different way of doing Jewish. Still no Christianity, still no Islam. A different way of doing Jewish. He's killed by the Romans. Those who came, who were his disciples, said, wow, we really like what he had to say, but it's so different from Judaism. Let's call this Christianity because we think that what he said was really the way to go. Christianity's born. Not far, there's another community that's inspired by Judaism, knows about Christianity, but says, oh no, there's another prophet. His name is Muhammad. Moses is a prophet, Abraham's a prophet, Jesus is a prophet, but Muhammad is the true prophet. And so Islam is born. 3 monotheistic faiths, all having a prophetic tradition. But Judaism is the only one that doesn't look at those prophets as part of our prophetic tradition. Maybe it's because there's, whatever, first, second, third. There was nothing around before, for us, and so it's just us. It's just our tradition. But later traditions can sort of look back and go, oh yeah, that works for me. And this works for me. But I'm still in my lane. And Jews generally have one lane, even though we honor and revere other faith traditions, and we certainly honor the notion that there is one God that unites us all. So I think that's a good place to stop. I want to thank you all so, so much. Thank you for having me. And I can stick around for a few more minutes in case you have individual questions. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ridberg. Next week in the forum will be Peter Boland, and he will be speaking about the mindfulness of Lent. Have a great Sunday, everyone.